Shameful. J.D. Vance accuses CNN anchor Brianna Keller of scrutinizing his military record from the safety and comfort of a CNN studio. At what point did military service become a liability? I also think that J.D. Vance as a messenger on this may be an imperfect messenger. You introduced him as a combat correspondent, which what his title was. But when you dig a little deeper into that, he was a public affairs specialist, which certainly the title combat correspondent kind of gives you a different impression. So he may be the imperfect messenger on that. At the same time, then you have this argument going on where it seems to be, did you really serve your country unless you were shot at a lot? And I just think that's very kind of gross place to be, because there is so much service and sacrifice that goes on in the military. Here you have them bickering over something which should be assets that they're both bringing. It's easy to sit in the comfort and safety of a CNN studio and trivialize the service of countless men and women who risked their lives, pointing to a list of military combat correspondents who either lost their lives or were severely wounded in the line of duty. I served with some of the people mentioned in this thread. I miss them all very much. Shameful of Keller CNN to slander an entire MOS. A correspondent is a journalist or commentator who reports news or commentary to a publication or news network from a remote location. So a combat correspondent would be a journalist who reports on combat. And how do you report on combat unless you get close to the action? So yeah, again, you can say he wasn't personally involved in any combat, but definitely he was more at risk of dying or being injured than Tim Walz, who straight up just quit. My father was in the Vietnam War. He was a scout. He was one of the first people who would go down and check for enemies. Did he personally see any combat? I don't know. I wasn't there. But I can say this, he did have a higher risk of being shot at or wounded because he was the first one out there scouting for the enemies. So we can go back and forth about how J.D. Vance isn't qualified to talk about, how Tim Walz isn't qualified to brag about his military service. But the fact of the matter is, because J.D. Vance was a combat correspondent, he was able to get close and personal to the combat and the other military personnel. He was able to give us a little bit more insight of the whole combat experience to outsiders, as opposed to Tim Walz, who gave us a little bit more insight as to why he should not be able to use his military record because he's a quitter. He knew there was a possibility of getting injured or killed, and he still went. It's not about how much combat you personally saw. It's about going versus not going. Tim Walz quit before Iraq deployment. J.D. Vance personally might not have seen combat, but he went to Iraq in 2005, where he knew there was a possibility of him getting hurt or killed, and he still went. Tim Walz knew the same thing. There was a possibility of him being hurt or killed. He quit. That's what this whole thing really boils down to. It's the decision to go or not to go. J.D. Vance is more of a man than Tim Walz.